All right, to get started on our exploration of Japan's feudal period, we're going to begin by just looking at Japan's geography and looking at how that affects Japan not only in the past but also today as well. All right, let's take a look at the term archipelago because Japan is an archipelago. An archipelago means a chain of islands. So in this case, the Japanese archipelago is about 100 miles off the Asian mainland. So if I look closely on this topographic map over here, you can see these are the four main islands of Japan, and a lot of these smaller islands are also part of Japan as well. So let's take a look then at what the four main islands are. In the north, we have Hokkaido. That's the northernmost island. Now, this island is very cold, tends to be very wintry there, and also it's populated by people who are not only Japanese, but also a group of people known as the Ainu. The Ainu are the indigenous people of Japan. They're the original inhabitants of Japan. So today they're a minority group, and sometimes they're discriminated against. And they also don't look so Japanese. They actually have big hairy beards on their faces, and they look a little bit more like Inuit or what we might call Eskimos, people from the area around Alaska. So these people were the original inhabitants of the island, but today it's part of Japan. The next island is Honshu. This is the big island. It's the main island of Japan. It's where most of the population lives, and it's where places like Tokyo are located as well. Then we have Shikoku, and then the southernmost big island is Kyushu. Alright, so these are the four main islands, but you should also keep in mind that there are hundreds of other islands that surround the archipelago of Japan. So although it is a chain of islands, these are the four main islands, but it's also surrounded by other islands as well. Okay, so let's make a quick comparison then between Japan and the United States. If I were to take a map of Japan, as I have here, and overlay it over the United States, in this case I've overlaid it on the east coast of the United States, you can get a rough idea of what size it really is. It basically stretches from about what we would say is Vermont down to just above Florida. So it would basically cover up that first part of the east coast of the US. It's really not that big. In fact, it has 145,882 square miles, which if I were to cram that together would make it roughly the size of California. Now, the United States, on the other hand, has 3,787,425 square miles. So the United States is much bigger than Japan. It's a much bigger place. Let's compare the population of Japan with the United States. Japan's population is 127,560,000. The United States has a population of 308,745,538, and that's as of the 2010 census that was just completed. So if you can see what's going on here, you should notice that Japan's got a pretty big population. In fact, it's got just over 1/3 of the population of the United States, but it's living in an area that's roughly the size of California. Really, it's an area that's about 25 times smaller than the United States as a whole. So these numbers can be a little bit misleading because we have to keep in mind that people that live both in Japan and the United States don't live equally distributed amongst the countries. They basically live in pockets. They live in population centers. So the problem here, though, is Japan is already a very small place, so it already has a very dense population. Now, let's take a look at some of the other characteristics of land and sea. First of all, 4/5 of the land in Japan is mountainous. So it's covered with mountains, lots of mountains. And many of those mountains are in fact volcanic, so they actually originated as volcanoes. So a lot of those mountains are volcanic rock. So 4/5 of the land is mountainous. People also live in narrow river valleys and along the coast. So what this map here shows you is that people don't necessarily live equally distributed amongst Japan. Remember, it's mostly mountainous, right? 4/5 of it's covered with mountains. So people don't live on tops of mountains. They live between the mountains. And in the case of Japan, they're going to live around that coastal region. Okay, so there's a good comparison. Take a look at that. There's the mountainous regions. There's where people live. Again, they don't live on tops of mountains. They're going to live in these dark green areas. And you can see there's some here. There's some in the middle here, and there's a really large one right here. This is known as the Kanto Plain, and you can see it. It's actually on this map over here as well. And that's because that's where Tokyo is located. So the capital of Japan is located in the Kanto Plain. It just happens to be the largest flat area on Japan. Alright, there's also limited arable land. Like I said, most of these mountains were formed through volcanic activity. That means that the land in Japan is mostly volcanic rock. There is arable land, which is land you can farm on, but there's not a lot of it. So the Japanese have to take good care of their land. They have to make good use of that land because there's not a lot of arable land to begin with. Also, the seas isolate it and help preserve their cultural identity. So because Japan's an archipelago, a chain of islands, they were isolated from the rest of Asia, and so their culture developed some unique characteristics that you don't find anywhere else. Also, you can think about what they eat. In this case, we got a picture here. It looks like sushi, and most people know what sushi is. It's basically raw fish. It's a delicacy, and it's a major staple of food in Japan. But the question to ask is, why would people in Japan eat raw fish? How did that actually develop as a cultural trait? Well, part of it is because they were isolated because they lived on an archipelago, but also it's because of the physical geography. There's not a lot of arable land, so you don't have people doing too much farming. You don't have people raising cattle because there's not a lot of flat land to graze cows, so people aren't eating meat. They can't grow too much food because the arable land is not extensive. And what we do know is that they live on islands, and those islands are surrounded by water. So fish become a major staple of their food supply. Also, keep this in mind. There's not a lot of trees in Japan. If you cut down a lot of the trees, there'll be erosion, and then what would happen is your topsoil would wash away. In this case, it would wash into the ocean, and so because Japan's surrounded by water. So in order to prevent the erosion of their topsoil, the Japanese are very good at limiting the cutting of trees and deforestation. So as a result of that, basically people have to find another source of fuel, such as cooking for food. So in the past, in the mainland, people would cut down trees as fuel, and they'd use that to cook with. In Japan, there's not a lot of trees to begin with. You don't want to cut down what trees you have or it will ruin your topsoil. So instead, you go to the seas for food, and in this case, you'll eat your fish raw because you don't have the fuel in order to cook it. So yes, it's a cultural trait, but it's also a sort of adaptation to the physical geography that makes up Japan. Japan is also part of what's known as the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire circles the Pacific region. This is a region where there's a lot of plate tectonic activity and volcanoes. So this is why it's known as the Ring of Fire. And again, I can see here it starts around South America, makes its way up to the west coast of Mexico, along the west coast of the United States and California, around Alaska, around the Aleutian Islands. Over here, it starts to stretch around Japan, and then it goes into the parts of Southeast Asia where there's a lot of islands and other archipelagos, and makes its way all the way down around Australia, down towards New Zealand. Okay, so the Ring of Fire is this region where there's lots of volcanic activity, and Japan is part of that. Again, this is the region where Japan is located right here. And one of the deepest trenches in the world is actually located right here off the coast of Japan. Now, there's also this volcanic activity that we mentioned. And if you look closely at this map, you can see right here, these red dots are all volcanoes. And so you can see, these are the main islands of Japan. There's a lot of volcanic activity here. This is also a region that has lots of earthquakes. So what this map here shows you is these red circles. The larger the circle, the larger the magnitude. And so Japan has been hit by many earthquakes, has lots of earthquakes every year. And this chart actually shows us the worst earthquake to hit Japan recently was a 6.9 Kobe earthquake. Kobe is a city in Japan. You can see it's located right here where the star is. And that happened in 1995. It was a very large earthquake. It actually had an impact on the global economy because that Kobe was a port city where Japan exported a lot of goods like computers, in particular computer laptop screens. And after that earthquake, the city and the port was basically destroyed, and it took many years for Japan to rebuild that and to get its economy going. But it affected the price of things like computer screens, particularly laptop screens, in the global economy. Here's some other maps you should take a look at. Again, at the top, you can see that Ring of Fire, the volcanoes stretching along the Pacific Ocean. And then down at the bottom, we have a map that shows the plates that make up plate tectonics. So in earth science, you may have learned that the Earth's crust is made out of plates. They're shifting, moving plates. And you can see that the Pacific plate is fairly large here in the center, and Japan is located right here on the very edge of it. So a lot of this contributes to the earthquakes and the volcanoes that are located along the Ring of Fire. And here's a quick diagram just to illustrate to you why that would be occurring. In this case, we have an oceanic plate that's actually going under another plate, and as a result of that, the pressure, the magma that builds up is released by volcanoes along the edge. Now, there's lots of different types of plate tectonic activity, but in this case, Japan is in an area where there's different types of plates. There isn't just one type of plate. All right. We also have the problem of tsunamis in Japan. Tsunamis are killer tidal waves, and these often are the result of the earthquakes that happen out on the ocean floor. And again, large waves have been known to hit Japan throughout history. We see it in Japan's traditional artwork, and even in modern Japan, where they actually build tsunami barriers around most coastal towns to protect them from oncoming tsunamis. Here's a picture of me. This was taken back in 2007. I went on a trip to Japan, and I thought it was important to go down to see the beach, to see the ocean. Of course, it didn't occur to me that a tsunami might come at any moment, so it was a little bit nerve-wracking. But anyhow, here's a sign that I saw. The highway was actually the barrier from the sea to protect people from the sea. But I remember seeing the sign there, and it said, tsunami, tidal waves caused by earthquakes. Basically move to higher ground quickly when you feel the earth move. So this was an unusual sign for me to see. I hadn't thought about it when I first went to the beach, and I basically hoped that the earth would not move that day. Here's another shot. This is like a little barrier that comes out at the beach. People go fishing out here. And then what they have is this lovely tile work here that shows the traditional picture of the Great Wave. This is a famous piece of Japanese artwork that we'll take a look at later. But the idea is to warn people that if you're out here fishing, you might want to be ready to run if the earth should move. So let's consider the topic of geographic diversity. If I consider the fact that Japan has volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunami, a lot of people might ask the question, why would you want to live here? Why would you want to live in this place? Yes, these events characterize Japan's geography, but it's not necessarily characterizing everyday life in Japan. People in Japan have learned to adapt and live with these realities, and in many ways the Japanese have been very good at adapting to them. They know there are volcanoes and there will be earthquakes and there are tsunamis. They've learned to live with them. Let's take a look at Tokyo. Tokyo is the capital of Japan, and it's a very crowded city. And you can see here on the map where it's located. It's right here where this red dot is located, right here, sort of central Japan. And what we know is that it has a total area of 837 square miles. And again, you can see it right here. This yellow area on the map is basically the area that we would call Tokyo proper. That's like sort of the central part of Tokyo. Now, this area of Tokyo has a population of 12 million people. That's 14,339 people per square mile. Now, for comparison, in our town, Burn Hills, there's 405 people per square mile. So there's essentially about just under 14,000 more people per square mile in Tokyo than there is in Burn Hills. Imagine living in your neighborhood, and imagine in that 1 square mile having to share it with an additional 14,000 people. That's how crowded Tokyo is. Now, many people that work in Tokyo actually commute from neighboring areas. So in this satellite image, I've zoomed out from where central Tokyo is located, and I'm looking at what's called Greater Tokyo. Now, Greater Tokyo has an area that's within a 30-mile radius of the city center. So if I go out from central Tokyo 30 miles, I'll get what's called Greater Tokyo. Now the population is different. It actually has a population of 35 million. As a result, Tokyo is actually considered the largest city in the world. It has more people in it than New York City and even Mexico City. Now, 1/4 of the entire population of Japan actually lives in Tokyo. So remember, we talked about how Japan is a country about the size of California compared to the United States, but has 1/3 of our population. The problem is that most of the people who live in Japan actually live in the city of Tokyo. So imagine if 1/4 of all Americans lived in one city, how crowded that city might be. That's essentially what's going on in Japan. Now, this is another set of maps that we've looked at earlier that I just want to go back to. If I look at this map, again, I can see over here, when we're talking about plate tectonics, we have the Eurasian plate here, we have the Philippine plate here, and we have the Pacific plate located right here. And here's Japan. There's Japan, and it's wedged in between these three plates. And I can see the volcanic activity in the red that's along Japan. And this map over here shows the number of earthquakes and the size of earthquakes that occur along the edge of Japan. Again, you can see here's the Eurasian plate right here. Over here is the Philippine plate, and over here is the Pacific plate. And so along the eastern edge of Japan, you can see there's a lot of volcanic activity. Let's take a look at some pictures of Tokyo. I mean, it's a pretty amazing place. These pictures show this city, which is the largest city in the world, basically never sleeps. Everything's lit up, lots of skyscrapers. It's really incredible. Right, this is the downtown central part of Tokyo. Right, this is the area in the Ginza where a lot of people go shopping. It's a major area. Again, a lot of people will look at this Americans and say, "Oh, it looks like Times Square," but you have to keep in mind Times Square wasn't always this nice. Back in the 70s and 80s, Times Square was kind of run down. It was only in the 1990s that they began to clean up Times Square and turn it into a big tourist destination. So in many ways, Times Square has been remodeled to look an awful lot like the Ginza in Tokyo. And also, take a look at those streets. Spotless. Japan's streets are really, really clean. People don't throw anything on the streets. People don't honk their horns when they're driving cars. It's really quiet and it's really clean. It's really quite amazing if they're able to pull that off. So here's another shot of the city from a distance. Here's some more. Lots of traffic, lots of cars, highways. It's really quite impressive. Okay, here's some more. Some more shots. It's pretty amazing. And so that's the largest city in the world. Now, back to these maps. What I want you to think about is, where is Tokyo located? If you pay close attention to this map here on the right, you can see this is where Tokyo is located. It's right here, which basically puts it right about here on this other map. And if you follow that line of volcanoes that comes down, you can see there's another line of volcanoes, many of them go underwater, that are right along this edge. And you can see the earthquake zone. There's a lot of earthquakes in the zone as well. But Tokyo is located in this region right here where the three plates, the Eurasian, the Philippine, and the Pacific plate, all meet in this spot. And as a result, there's lots of earthquakes and there's lots of volcanoes. It's actually, from the perspective of these two maps, one of the worst places that you could put your capital city, because it's located where three different plates meet. And they're all doing different things. Some of them are subducting, some of them are grinding against each other. So with all that kind of activity and earth movement to the crust going on, that plate tectonics, it makes Tokyo a very difficult place to live. So let's take a look at why. Because in 1923, there was a very big earthquake in Tokyo. Now back then it was referred to as Kanto. The Kanto Plain was where Tokyo was located. And this earthquake was so large it devastated the city. And you can see in these pictures, it was pretty dramatic. Now, many of the newer buildings stood standing, but most of the wooden buildings did not. In fact, a lot of what destroyed the city after the earthquake was a giant fire that rolled through the city and killed many people. So again, Tokyo has had big earthquakes before. And here you can see this is what was at that time a new modern steel building, but it practically melted from the flames. Okay, and here's a picture of one of the buildings burning. So the fire was almost as bad as the earthquake. The earthquake started the fires, but many of the older buildings just went up in flames instantly. Here's some other shots, and you can see the crowds panicking. And at the bottom here, you have a really good panoramic shot of the city after the fire had made its way through and destroyed most of the city. Now, why is this important to us? Because it's not a question about if an earthquake will happen again in Tokyo. The real question is, when will it happen? Because of Tokyo's location at the three spots where those plates meet, and because of the level of volcanic activity and earthquakes and the shifting of plate tectonics, it's basically a given fact that Tokyo will suffer an earthquake at some point in the future. It may actually be within our lifetimes. And this time when it happens, it will be far worse than what happened in the past, because now Tokyo is a major international finance center. The Japanese economy is very closely tied in with the global economy, and if an earthquake were to hit Tokyo, especially with 1/4 of most Japanese people living in that city, it would be devastating, not just to Japan, but to the global economy as well. This is why we need to have a very good understanding of Japan's physical geography.